I'm here with the composer and sound artist Jacob Cooper. He's got a new album out. It's called Terrain, and it's three different vocal works here. I want to talk about all of them. I've been listening to the album, really enjoying it as an immersive experience. And first of all, Jacob, let me welcome you and thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So the album is called Terrain, and the name comes from the track that you wrote in 2020. And there are two other tracks on here, Ripple the Sky and Expiation. A lot of things to talk about. First of all, can you just give us a little history of these three pieces?
Yeah, so I wrote Ripple the Sky in 2016 for the vocalist Theo Bleckmann. It was a commission from the LA Philharmonic, and I decided to write a piece. It was for their new music group, so I could write up to like 18 performers or something. And I decided that I knew I wanted to do a vocal piece, and thought that a string accompaniment would make sense. So we went with 8 string players, a string octet, and their parts are all processed as well. And then Expiation was written a couple years later for the vocalist Jodie Landau, commission from Jodie. And I think the commission was either for like, a 7 or 8 minute piece or something, 7, 8 or 10 minute piece or something like that. And it ended up being 18 minutes, which is something that's happened in my music lately, and maybe should have happened earlier too, but where my pieces just tend to get longer and longer than I think they will. And then the last piece, Terrain, I wrote more recently as a way to sort of tie the album together. I knew I had these two works and felt like they fit together pretty well. They're both for male vocalists with accompaniment, but I liked the idea of having a piece that involved both Theo from the first piece and Jodie from the second piece, so it has both of them in it. And then I used the cellist Ashley Bathgate, who appears as one of the string players in the first piece. So it's basically for those three performers, the two vocalists and then Ashley. And it ties the album together in a way that it takes some musical material from those first two pieces. The poet for the third piece, Zach Savage, I gave him the task of reacting to the text in the first two pieces and the music in the first two pieces. So we sort of built it around tying the album together.
Once on a foreign street, I stumbled drunk among the tears of many mourners.
You mentioned the poet Zach Savage, and a couple of other poets on here as well. I mean, we can't talk about the music without talking about the text, because your music is so intertwined with these poems. And the poems themselves are fairly long. As you mentioned, your music tends to stretch things out. The poetry itself is so layered. Can you talk a little bit about the individual poems? If we go back and start with Ripple the Sky, I know there's a connection there to Robert Schumann.
Correct, yeah. So I'll just say very generally with the collaborative process first, with these poets, we're developing our works together. So it's not like the traditional thing where a composer takes a pre-existing poem and says, I want to set this to text, and has to work with that text as it's written. We would have a lot of back and forth throughout the process. We would start with sketches, then we'd figure out which avenues to take on the text. And then, later on I could say, could you add a line here? Could you shorten the syllables here? Because I need it to fit. So I'm very spoiled in that respect. But to get into more detail about each piece, the first piece, Ripple the Sky, takes inspiration from the composer Robert Schumann and his attempted suicide and his mental deterioration, really, in the last few years of his life. He tried to jump in the Rhine River, which was right near his house. And I was initially going to do a piece about water and the drought that LA was experiencing at the time of this commission. And then I thought about, there's this interesting the piece was commissioned for a Liederabend, like an evening of song concert. And I said, Schumann's one of these fathers of the art song forefathers. So I thought it could be interesting to focus on him for it. Then I pitched this idea to Greg Brownderville, the poet, and he said that immediately reminded him of Ophelia from Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, who struggles with mental illness and eventually does actually succeed in killing herself by drowning. And I said, oh, that's kind of interesting, but maybe it's too out there. Let's see. But then when we learned more about it, it turned out that Schumann actually had an interesting relationship with the fictional character Ophelia. He said a song about Ophelia. He wrote about her in his diary sometimes, and there did seem to be something there. And a biographer had written about how Schumann, the day that he checked himself into the mental institution, he took a carriage there, and his wife Clara had given him flowers, and he handed out flowers to each person in the coach. And there's of course the famous scene in Hamlet where Ophelia, her quote-unquote mad scene, where she's handing out flowers to everyone else, and we've sort of liked that ironic moment, and took off from there.
Mighty shroud as the mountain snow, lauded with sweet flowers.
Well, let me ask you about Ripple the Sky. Just the title is so evocative to begin with. You think of ripples in the water, and you mentioned it being conceived first as perhaps a water piece, and then it's sort of inverted, and you reflect so much the feeling of water, of incompleteness in Ripple the Sky with what you do with the voices and the music. And there are also these pauses, and when I first listened to it, I thought maybe my CD player was skipping or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about your musical approach to this particular poem?
Sure. Yeah, a few things to say about that. First off, on the skipping, I remember when I first had the demo recording, I sent a video to my parents, and my dad was like, "It's broken. Something's the matter." I was like, "No, that's how it's supposed to be." And then on the title, we actually took that from Greg found this in a line that Schumann had written in his diary, because the text is mostly Greg's, but we did take direct lines from Schumann's diary and other inspiration from it and stuff. And so the title is actually from some part where he had an entry where he was talking about being in the water, and he had written "not a ripple, comma, the sky," and then had a new sentence happening after that. But we liked this idea of putting them together, and it does fit with this whole sense of fragmenting, as you pointed out. So I'm glad that you found that. And so, yeah, for us, the text in this piece, especially the haltingness at the beginning, is inspired by the idea that at the very end of his life, Schumann had a lot of trouble speaking. So he would, there's this famous anecdote of Brahms visiting him, and Brahms saying that because they were friends, Brahms saying that he could, barely understand what he was talking about, and he was murmuring a lot and muttering a lot. And then it also takes inspiration from the fact that Schumann had these oral hallucinations. So he would hear things in his head that, sometimes he felt like melodies were being sung to him and stuff, and he would actually even transcribe them, and it turned out that it would be a piece that he'd already written. People would find out later. But he would hear things in his head. Famously, he always heard the pitch A in his ear, which he complained about, and contemporary historians think that maybe that was just actually tinnitus that he was suffering from. But so we take this idea of these sounds just sort of being heard from afar, and extrapolate the idea that Ophelia is one of these sounds, one of these hallucinations. So she sings to him and during part of this piece.
The song Expiation, and to betray my ignorance, I had to look up that word to make sure I knew what it meant.
Oh yeah, I didn't know it before this piece either. So you're not the only one.
Can you talk about that? That was commissioned by the singer Jodie Landau, right?
Correct. That was commissioned for Jodie. Yeah, and so the concept of this piece, it really fits in this larger project I'm working on now, which is actually a choral work called Threnos, which is it's sort of like a requiem but for animals. So I think of it as like a 75-minute to 90-minute piece about basically time to reflect on animal death in a way that you can think about a standard requiem like a Mozart requiem or something being, of course, it's about Christ's death, but it's also allows a listener opportunity to think about death in general, death of loved ones, and spirituality in that sense. So this is with that, but it's applied to animals, and we call the text paraliturgical in that it like could exist in a liturgy. It sort of sounds like it's somewhat churchy, but doesn't actually exist in a real liturgy. So that word expiation is directly tied to that, and that it's expiation is basically like a way to find retribution or a way to make amends. And it is associated with Christianity. So this piece particularly is this one solo moment that happens during the choral work, where it's about this person who is coming to grips with the fact that they have committed atrocities in a way, or have killed animals, and how they come to grips with that. So a lot of the piece really ultimately is about humans and how we can cope with our experiences of killing animals. And so this piece is basically the narrator struggling with that. And it can more largely also be about brutality and violence, because I don't think the word animal is actually ever mentioned in the piece. But so outside the context of Threnos, it can certainly be seen in that way too.
It ends with a particularly haunting line from the poetry, which you use in such a way that it really is thought-provoking, where they talk about equating the voice with the throat and the idea of slitting the throat of animals. I know the final word that you set is voice. You bring that back.
Yeah. I'm glad you noticed that. So that really applies to Threnos in general, themes within that piece. So actually the full title of the piece is Threnos parentheses for the throat, because Dora Malik, the poet, and I, as we thought a lot about it, we realized how the throat is a really interesting locus point of vulnerability, thinking about animals, especially pigs, being slaughtered through their throats, the throat being something that's so important for that, but also for singing and for vocal production. And this piece Threnos is a vocal theater work, so there's a theatrical element to it as well, and it's for women's choir, so certainly the voice is playing a significant role there. And voice is also just so significant in the boundary between humans and animals. Like we often think about humans having language and animals not, and that's something that makes us different. And so we're sort of playing with that boundary or analyzing that boundary.
So many layers involved in this music. You mentioned Terrain, the piece you wrote for this album, kind of ties it together. The first two works really are talking about challenges that we face in life. And the last piece is a little more hopeful, would you say?
Yeah, I would say hopeful. I mean, I think in a way, if expiation is about trying to make amends with things, Terrain is sort of doing the same, but also more hopeful in that it's trying to find a way. I think a lot of Terrain is about these ideas of the infinite and the instantaneous. So like these brief moments that happen in life that are beautiful, can we hold on to those beautiful moments and make them last in eternity? Because I'm very interested in this idea of the infinite present, or the eternal present, playing with ideas of time and making things that are very short seem like they could be very long, which fits with my music as well.
Well, maybe talk a little bit about the musical structure of Terrain. It's interesting, the spotlight is on the cellist, Ashley Bathgate, at the beginning, and she's sort of doing this harmonic series. I wonder what kind of overarching ideas you had going into this piece musically, approaching it musically.
Yeah, so I started with a sketch, and I think I mentioned that I took pre-existing music in this. So I took music, a drone from Ripple the Sky. So about 4 minutes into Ripple the Sky, there's this low C drone on the cellos, lowest pitch on the cello, that I felt like worked in that moment. And I was like, but I could do something more with this too. So I started with that drone that goes throughout all of Terrain. And then I figured that I would add something for a solo cello on top of it. And this idea of these arpeggios, which, sort of sound like the harmonic series in terms of their spacing, like they're larger at first and then get smaller towards the end. That seemed to me to be a nice contrast, to have these very individual ethereal things that rise. And it's actually incredibly difficult to play those higher pitches. So many of them are harmonics, and the intonation, natural harmonics, and the intonation is just automatically off. But Ashley was resilient with it, and if anyone can make it work, she can. So the cello line came next for that, and then for the vocals, I like the idea of just having a simple melody over this droney world, and those arpeggios that happen in the cello eventually become more part of that droney world. Like they start off as a big contrast, but then I add a lot of reverb and sort of push them back into the mix in a way that they become more of that context they're put in that context more. So when the vocals come out, that's sort of the contrasting element.
Have you felt the bones get soft? Have you seen the dust lean down?
How much input do your collaborators have in actually creating the music? I'm thinking of Theo Bleckmann and what he does with his vocalisms and the other performers on this disc.
Yeah, great question. It changes from piece to piece. Let's see. So for Ripple the Sky, I had like a couple workshop sessions with Theo where I was like, just do some crazy stuff and I'm going to record it. And then I incorporated that in. And then we said, okay, let's do some like mouth noisy kind of stuff here. Let's do some like gibberish kind of stuff here. So I'd have that recording and then would put it in as I needed. The melody and all the melodies in Ripple the Sky were my own. In Terrain, the way that I worked was I created melodies myself over this droney texture and sang them myself very poorly to see what would work, and then had both Jodie and Theo sing the lines I had written, but then also had them improvise their own stuff over that. So ultimately, most of the lines that I used, most of those melodies I used were mine, but I did incorporate a few that they had done themselves. And then with Ashley, the noisy stuff that you hear in the cello is mostly stuff that she did. Like I'd have ideas about what to do. I'd say like, can you play on the bridge? Can you do scratchy kind of thing here? So I just kind of let her go for half an hour, and then she would, she sent me the material, and then I incorporated it. For the first piece, also in Ripple the Sky, Anne Lanzoliti, the viola player who incidentally also wrote the liner notes for the album, is a wonderful violist who does a lot of extended techniques and has worked with the composer Andrew Norman a lot on that. So I basically stole a bunch of those ideas that she has done a lot and worked with her on that. She recorded them for me and stuff on that. So in a sense, that was her contribution as well.
Jacob Cooper, the composer, has a new album. It's called Terrain, coming out this month from New Amsterdam Records. Jacob, thanks so much for spending some time and talking about the music on this new album here on FM 81.
Thanks so much, Brad. I really appreciate it.